Hello everyone and welcome to Zobrio University's webinar on MIP voiding and purging. Today we have Kathy Dwyer, a Senior Application Consultant here at Zobrio, to lead the webinar. If you have any questions, please leave them in the chat, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and we will go over all questions at the end. Thank you, and I will now hand it over to Kathy.
Thanks, Colleen. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your day to run through a quick webinar that specifically is going to address voiding checks, reversing invoices, and where you can find the information that the system requires in order to accomplish those tasks here in Avila MIP. Okay. Hopefully you can all see my screen. I am at in the classic version of MIP, more or less at the, I refer to it as the main page. And what I'm going to do first of all is talk about how do you, first and foremost, go in and void a check. And in order to do that, certainly what you do is you go to activities, down to check writing, and what you'll see to the right here is an option to void checks, vouchers, or invoices. Okay, so let's go ahead and open that up. Okay, and classically what happens with all our MIP transactional screens is it starts out with a session panel where you can either enter a session ID, or I'm going to go ahead and hit the plus sign to have the system assign me a session ID. Okay. I tend to process a status of BP or batch to post. And then this description, while it's not required, as you can see, it doesn't, I chose orange for highlighted fields to which ones are required. And although the description is not required, we do encourage you to put something in that field to indicate what the session is all about. Now, to the right of that, the date that you see there, it's just that date is informational in the sense that it's just the physical calendar date that you're creating the void. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the effective date into your GL, which that, quite honestly, is controlled by the next two fields down, where I'm going to go ahead and click on Use the Original Effective Date, or if you prefer to assign a new effective date to the void, you can do that as well. Okay. When to use the original date versus a new effective date, it really more or less ties back to, have you closed a time period and reconciled your cash? Maybe at that point you want to use a new effective date and not back post into a reconciled period. Okay, but that's one example of a question that you might ask yourself. But for example, we'll go ahead and use the original effective date. I'm going to go ahead and hit the Start button, and the system is going to bring up our grid of different checks that have been run through the system. By default, in the upper right-hand side of the screen, that quadrant, the system has a date parameter or filter set automatically. And the reason it does that is, as we know, over time, a check file can get pretty extensive, and rather than waiting for the grid to load, it is set at a parameter, I believe it's like 6 months, anything greater than 5.1, so that there's a limited amount of data that loads in the grid. Okay, but there's nothing that says you can't come in here and say, you know what, I want to look for a specific transaction date. Okay, which I'm going to go ahead and do because I have a couple of checks here that I want to run through the different options. So I'm going to go ahead and filter instead of greater than. I'm going to select a specific date and go ahead and filter the grid, just again to limit the amount of detail that we see, so illustrate the points that we're trying to make today. Okay, just as a quick side, sometimes people will filter on the document number, which in this case, being a check, the document number is a check number. Okay. Now, what you'll see here in the grid is I basically ran through 2 checks through the system. Okay. the XYZ, or the second entry in the system here in the grid, was basically a single invoice for $100. Okay, it generated check number 1006. Okay, and the top entry, which is to Staples, generated check 1005, and that actually consisted of two invoices. One was for $25, one was for $35, to give us a check total of $60. Okay, now, the reason I have those two conditions is this, is in the grid to the left-hand side, you have the different check boxes. Okay, that basically means if I put a check mark in that box or either one of those boxes, it means I want to go ahead and void those two checks. Okay, and as we read across the screen horizontally, we're going to come to a column that says reverse invoice. And what we can see with the XYZ Corporation check, or the second one, is the reverse invoice has a highlight so that I can select that. The upper entry for Staples, I can't put a check mark in there. The system rejects that. And the reason for that is the next column over that says reverse restrictions. If it's a blank value, such as we see on the XYZ Corp, you can definitely put a check mark in the reverse invoice box. But if there is a reverse restriction, any value in that field, it's not going to let us hit the reverse invoice. And there's four reverse restrictions which are intentionally put into the software. And they run the gamut is sometimes if you put through an expense that didn't involve an invoice, there would not be an invoice to reverse. If there was a partial payment that was out there against this vendor and check, you could not, basically it's against the invoice, you couldn't reverse it. If there was pending activity against that invoice, you couldn't reverse it. And probably the most common is what we see here is the reverse restriction is multiple invoices. So remember we stated Staples had the two invoices, therefore it's saying you can void the check, but I'm not going to let you reverse the invoice here in this screen. And what we're going to do is show you how you can go back and reverse invoices when it's not possible to do a void and a reverse on this one screen. Okay. Now, just a quick aside is, with the XYZ Corporation, when we say void the check, it's basically going to put money back into our cash account. When we say allow it to reverse the invoice, basically it's going to go in and credit typically our expense account that the invoice was charged against. And it takes away all markers. It's no longer an open invoice. It's just kind of, I want to say an eraser, but it's really a reversal so that you have the audit trails of the ins and the outs. When you talk about a reverse restriction, such as with our Staples and our inability to reverse the invoice, we'll do that next. We'll show you how you can go back and make the decision of whether you want to reissue another check for this invoice, or if you really do want to reverse or cancel that invoice. Okay. So what we do here is we've made our selections. Okay. We're going to go ahead and tell the system okay. And the system is just going through some checks to make sure that all the data passes tests. And when it comes back and says that basically we're good, you can hit the finish button. Okay, takes us right out of that void checks and voucher invoice screen. But do remember this, and whether you're a person that prefers to go activities and manage sessions and post, or if you prefer to basically open up any one of these more graphical interface, we need to remember to go to post these transactions, okay? Now, what you'll see, what makes these link together basically is, notice the first two entries in the lower table here. API, of course, is for our accounts payable invoice. APV is for our accounts payable voids. They share the same session ID, the same session date, and the same session description. And what ends up happening, and I'll click it in this order, is when you post this, what this message is that pops up is it's basically saying, well, you really can't post the invoice without posting the void of the check as well. They're a pair. They get selected together, and then when you go ahead and post those, what that will do is complete the process of voiding. In one instance, the check and the invoice was reversed. In the other instance with Staples, only the check was reversed. Okay. Now, just kind of vet that out and see the results is, keep in mind you can always go up under, get out of there. We can always come up under reports. We can go to a check and voucher register, and you can always create and catalog a voided check register, or you might use just your normal check register. What makes it unique just to get the voided checks is if you go to the filter tab, filter on your transaction source equal to APV or accounts payable voids. Okay, and what that will do is by setting that filter, when we go ahead and bring that up on the screen, what you're going to see is those two checks that we just went through the process of voiding them. Okay, so that's one way to get the register. And always keep in mind too is what you want to, the content that you see on this report can be controlled by the content here and what fields that you select. But it's the biggest key to this report is filtering by transaction source equal to APV. Okay, now what ends up happening at this point is, and let me bring this up here. Let me bring up the accounts payable graphic, okay, is I'm going to swing over into select invoices to pay, and I'm going to basically hit my plus sign and get a session ID, and I'm going to just go ahead and violate my rule and not put in a description because I just want to illustrate something here. I'm going to hit the start button, okay. And what you're going to see here in this grid is the bottom two entries are for Staples. And there's our $35 invoice and a $25 invoice, which made up our $60 check. And what happens in this instance is we went ahead and voided the check, but the system restricted us from reversing the invoice. And it's at this point you can make a decision. You might just want to say, you know what, the original check got, they got lost in the mail or got chewed up in the mail machine. Something went wrong. And you might simply want to come back in here and just select those two entries and go back through your check printing program or procedures and recreate a check for those invoices. Okay, and that's just, again, standard operating procedure of selecting those invoices and going through the process. Okay. On the other hand, you might have a situation where it's like, you know what, I voided the checks. We're going to really cancel those invoices. We don't want them in the system. There was some condition that indicates get rid of them. Okay. Now, to do that, we basically reverse the invoice, which will, in effect, take them out of the select to pay or select invoices to pay grid, and it will also go in and credit your expense account and put money back against that expense line. Okay. Now, to do that, you really need to have a couple of pieces of information regarding those invoices. And what I tend to tell people to do is, whether low down in the bottom kind of center of the screen, there's vendor balances. You can also get there through activities, accounts payable, and display vendor balances either way. But what ends up happening here is something like this. Let me give us the first instance where we had XYZ Corporation, and I'm going to just leave it at look up all activity for calendar year 2018. Okay, and what you'll notice here is, let me drill into this just to show you the activity. This was the instance where the first horizontal line for API indicates we had invoice number 123 for $100. The second horizontal line indicates APS or system generated check. Check number 1006 was cut or generated. And then the next two lines, you got API and APV again, and you'll notice the session number is VCK, short for voided check, and the same session number. And in this case, the invoice is now a negative 100, which reverses the original or top entry for a positive 100, and the APV is a positive 100, which negates or reverses the APS of a negative 100. So here's an example where with this vendor, it completely reversed. Okay. On the other hand, when I say staples, okay, and go ahead and display that information, the difference on the front panel is we have an outstanding balance of 35 and 25. And by drilling into these transactions, what we'll see in each instance is API for transaction type, then an APS and an APV, which invoice, system generated check, and a voided check. So the APS and the APV entries negated one another, and we're left with the invoice. Okay. Now, to reverse those invoices or negate them so we're back to a balance of 0, the type of information that you need to get here is on a reversal is you need to know the original session number that the invoice was keyed in on. And this is one way you can always find this information is by going into your vendor file and drilling into a vendor. And as you can see, we have session number API 0007. We have a document number 765, which in essence, that top one, that's our invoice number. And we also have a document number on the second entry API in the grid, 987. And that's the type of information that we need in order to accomplish the reversal that we're going to demonstrate right now. Okay, so let me go ahead and say close to this. Okay, now on an invoice reversal, what you do is you go up to enter invoices. Okay, and here you start off just as you would normally adding any invoices. You can enter or hit the plus sign to get a session ID. I'm going to leave it at batch to post. And I'm going to basically, again, give it a description just to say what I'm doing here. Okay. The date is, again, is not the effective date, but more or less this is the day, the calendar date that I'm doing the work. Okay, we'll go ahead and hit the start button. Okay, and the key is here is when you get to this invoice field, is not to enter the invoice number, but rather what you do is you hit the icon, the 2 pages with the red arrow, which indicates we're going to reverse a posted document. Okay, and what that simply means is, yep, we entered our invoice, and it was long ago posted. So this is how we go about and reverse a posted entry and create an audit trail in the system of what occurred. Okay. And what it wants to know is here in this pop-up box is, okay, what session number should I go to that contains the invoice? And again, you can hit the drop down and filter through and take a swag at it. Or again, we glean that information from our vendor balances display. Okay. Depending on the size of your original session number, you may hit the drop down, or you could simply key in the original invoice number. I'll go ahead and get 765, which is the first of the 2 invoices I want to get rid of. And as you'll note, by default, the system uses the original document date and the original effective dates, fills in the original document description. You can alter those if you see fit. Okay, but if I simply, at this point, accept the defaults and say OK, what you'll see here is this message basically indicates that in the setup of our AP module, we set a flag that basically allows what they call a pending entry. And I'm going to hit that, confirm that. And that's simply, you may or may not get this question based on how your AP was configured, but it basically links or allows you to say, you know what, I'm going to work with this vendor invoice, so that it links the add and the void or reversal together, so that you know, you can reuse those numbers, which in essence we're doing here on the reversal. So it's just one of those where you want to confirm it. And the big thing that you'll see here is on the reversal, the amount there off center up at the top, our invoice is now in the negative because we're reversing. The lines in the grid, you'll notice the top line is our expense line, and that's being credited. Our accounts payable is being debited, so it's a reversal. And the key here is don't make any changes to this entry. Okay, on a reversal, always just reverse it as it originally went in. So you're basically selecting it, saving it, and now in our instance, we have a second invoice that we want to reverse for Staples. So same thing, I hit that reversal icon, 2 pages with the red arrow. It wants to know our original session number. Okay, and in this case, the next invoice number, I hope I did that right, and okay to that. Okay, again, it's just, again, telling us about the pending entries, or I kind of think of it as a link, and that's okay, keep them together. And again, same thing, negative amount on the overall invoice, our expenses being credited, our accounts payable is being debited, and we'll go ahead and hit the save. Okay. And like as any batch or session number, you can hit the drop arrow, you can recall back any of these entries, take a look at them. But for the most part now, let's go ahead and close that. Okay. Always remember we need to post, and in this instance, because we're reversing the invoice separate from the void, we have just a single source API. We're going to select that session and go ahead and post it. Okay. When I close out, that basically, I'll just to show you this, let me expand my screen. If we come back in here to select invoices to pay and start her up, what you'll notice now is previously, or prior to reversing the invoices, Staples appeared at the bottom of this grid. By reversing those invoices, it has removed the entries from the grid. And likewise, what it's done here with your vendor balances is if we now come back over to Staples and we display the outstanding balance in the grid to the right is now 0. And if we expand or drill into our transactions, the API is reversed by an API. The APS is reversed by an APV, which again, invoice, system-generated check, void check, and basically that completes the void of not only the check, but the reversal of the invoice. Okay. Now, let me tell you one more thing, and then we'll open up to questions if you have any. There is also here under activities and check writing, you'll notice below void checks is a cancel void checks, vouchers, and invoices. This is kind of handy that, let's say you voided a check or an invoice, a combination of both, and later realized, oops, I got the wrong one, or I shouldn't have done that. The cancel void checks, vouchers, and invoices is a way to undo. So it's, again, always like to have those trap doors to allow us to correct something that might have been posted or misposted, or, you know, we all make a mistake here and there, and it gives us that option to reverse an entry. Okay, so that is basically just a quick hit on voiding checks and reversing invoices, locating information in the vendor balances screen. Does anybody have any questions they would like to share? Okay, you can do that through the chat, or again too, and let me give you my email address. So if you do run into anything and would like to send me an email, that's certainly welcome. And it's Kathy with a K, .Dwyer, DWYER, at Zobrio.com. So at any time, feel free, if you have questions and would like to kick around a subject, give me a call and we can talk about it.
Alrighty, thank you everyone for joining us. A recording of this webinar will be made available shortly.
Thanks all. Have a good day.